Hi everybody, my name is Michael Smith. I'm a Johannesburg-based artist, writer and teacher, and today I'll be speaking to you about how to write about your own artwork. The first step, the first thing we need to cover is how not to write about your own artwork. One of my first tips is to not make grandiose claims. There's an entire body of knowledge out there, French theory, alchemy, spirituality and mysticism, a lot of the things you learned about at university or at school. Be very careful when you start writing about those, because you need to couch your language in such a way that you are not claiming that territory as your own, and that you're not inserting yourself as a major player in any body of theory like that. Keep your tone humble, be direct, and keep your content factual. It tends to work best. Second point, don't reference too many schools of thought. When you're writing about your own work, you tend to want to sort of establish terrain. This point kind of overlaps with the previous one, but you tend to want to establish a whole set of conceptual areas that you're interested in, that you touch upon, and putting too many in is problematic because it will just end up confusing your viewer, your audience. If you're writing to a gallery or you're applying for a grant, you'll end up sort of kind of alienating people. To a certain extent, you have to kind of own what you're doing, independent of theory, and independent of all of these kind of schools of thought. Another part of that is that we tend to use those theories as a way to kind of bolster what we're about, which can come off as fairly inauthentic. If you have an internet connection and you're not offended by this, I would suggest going to have a look at a site called www.artbollocks.com. It's absolutely hysterical. It's a generator, an online generator, where you kind of hit a button and it generates what your theory is all about. And obviously it's satirical, and what it's satirizing is this art world tendency to, want to create a sense of novelty and oddness about what you're doing by referencing all of these strange, disparate kind of schools of thought. And again, it comes off as inauthentic. So own your own space, own what you're doing, speak from the heart, and write with authority. You will write with authority if you're writing about what you care about. My third point is don't neglect context. You need to think very carefully about the context into which your piece of writing is going. Is it a proposal for funding? Is it an artist statement for a gallery? Has the gallery tasked you with writing the press release? That very often happens for emerging artists where gallery staff are minimal and people kind of have to do two or three jobs. Proposals, for instance, would be require far more detail. They would require a certain degree of academic positioning, and they'd focus very much on the particularities of your practice. Whereas a gallery press release or an artist statement would be possibly shorter, definitely more direct, and it would be about you establishing, where you're coming from and why you've made what you've made in the most direct manner possible. There's no harm or there's no shame in strategically tailoring, what you're writing. So you don't just kind of, again, have this weird idea of authenticity and kind of go, well, this is what I want to write, so I'm going to write it the way I want to. You have to think about who's receiving, your copy, your text. My fourth point is don't pepper your text with errors, profanity, colloquialisms, and irrelevancies. There are artists out there that play this game really, really well. For instance, Tracy Emin, a lot of her applique works have the most wonderful misspellings in them. Christopher Wool, abstract artist from the States. Kendall Gears, one of South Africa's sort of great artists of the 90s and 2000s. Paul McCarthy. Also, all of these are no strangers to profanity in their work, dealing with very, very difficult content. And irrelevant musings are also a huge part of what artists like Rob Pruitt and William Pauhida do. But the point is to keep your work separate from your writing. So remember that all of those things are fine for your work. You can deal with those kind of weird, sort of nebulous musings and you wandering around a whole set of concepts or swearing or doing whatever you need to do. But your writing is a professional presentation of your concerns and your interests. So remember to adopt a tone that's commensurate with that, a tone that sort of presents you to as broad an audience as possible in a way that doesn't dumb down what you're doing or doesn't undersell what you're doing. My fifth point is don't drown your text in IAE. What is IAE? To the uninitiated, it is International Art English, and it was sort of identified by a couple of theorists a few years ago who spotted in the art world a very particular strain of English, sort of very jargonistic, very sort of pretentious and sort of wannabe academic. And they linguistically traced it back to Rosalind Krauss, who had been the editor of October magazine, a very academic art journal, I think in the 1970s or 80s. And they found that what Rosalind Krauss and the editorial staff of October had been doing is translating French theory into English and then using the terminology to write press releases. And it kind of became this phenomenon in the art world. E-flux is a great place to spot International Art English. They're probably going to sue me for this. But it kind of is a strain of English that seems to be about keeping people out, mystifying art, making art more difficult than it has to be. My strong suggestion after years of working as an editor, having a fair amount of experience in galleries and as an artist, is make your text accessible. Ask yourself, why am I trying to make my text inaccessible? Do I want to sound clever for my lecturers? Do I want only the lecturers and the curators to get it and not my parents? Well, you know, that's pretty harsh. Your parents should be able to understand what you're doing. I always said that I feel like complicated text or complicated ideas can be presented in simple ways. So be very careful of relying too heavily on jargon and kind of like a received wisdom about what art is. The problem with that, with doing that, is that you become a lazy thinker. You're not really fully understanding what your artwork is about if you're doing that. If you're just using, you know, terminology like intersectionality and interstice and post-studio practice and all of these kinds of things that people in a very small coterie in the art world understand, then what are you doing? You're limiting your market, you're limiting your audience, and again, it's lazy thinking. You're possibly not always understanding what those terms mean when you use them. My sixth point is don't leap immediately into analyzing your own artwork in your artist's writing. It's almost certainly a bad idea to take on the role of the critic or the historian of your own production. You have to remember that there are divided roles or there are separate roles in the art world. You know, you as a producer will be making work and talking about your process of making it. There'll be a whole separate role where people interpret that work. You know, critics or historians will look at it, curators will look at it, and they'll write stuff about it, hopefully, if you're lucky. But don't do their job for them, because it comes off as wooden, it comes off as kind of, again, trying to preempt the reception of your work. And that becomes problematic. A lot of artist statements that I've read, especially from young emerging artists, try to unpack the work preemptively. And I suppose, like at an energetic level, they're trying to own the reception of that work. And it's kind of something you can't do. As a young artist or as an emerging artist, I think as any artist of any status or stage in their career, you're going to make work and put it out into the world, and the world is going to do with it what it wants to do, and you kind of have to deal with that. So, you know, I think you can guide people, you can write in your artist statements about your thinking process, about your emotional state when you did it, about what you actually did, you know, factually, how you developed this thing and then that thing, and you created layers or whatever you did. But trying to own the meaning too soon is problematic, I would suggest. My seventh suggestion for what you shouldn't do when you're writing about your artwork is avoid reading art writing. Some artists have a very strange belief, and I think it comes from university some of the time, where they kind of believe that there needs to be a certain purity to their production. So they need to shut out outside influences, and they kind of need to just vent their spleens or whatever it might be. And I feel like that's a really dangerous way to approach your art making and your art writing. I think you need to be reading art writers to be able to situate yourself within a broader debate. You need to understand how other people are kind of working in a similar area to you. If you were part of a tech startup or a crypto startup or something like that, you would need to know the jargon. You would need to kind of understand how your company is situating itself in relation to other services being offered. Now, you're not exactly the same as an art producer, but there is a degree, there's a certain wisdom in understanding that you're working in a competitive field, and you need to understand how to talk about your work and how to write about your work in relation to what's come before, in relation to what's happening in this contemporary moment. I think those are really, really powerful things to do. I strongly suggest that you familiarize yourself with professional art writing as well. There are a lot of great art writers out there. ArtForum is not the only place. ArtForum tends to be a very impenetrable tome of kind of highbrow writing filled with tons of adverts, weirdly. I would suggest reading Adrian Searle on The Guardian website. He writes 300, 400-word reviews of shows that are amazing. Jerry Saltz, who writes for vulture.com, who's one of the most irrepressible figures on the art writing scene. And he does this great thing every now and then where he writes a 3-sentence review. Admittedly, these are very long run-on sentences that have got lots of semicolons in them, but it's a really good exercise in parsing what you do and kind of cutting it down. Roberta Smith, who Jerry Saltz is her husband, she writes for the New York Times. She's a very authoritative kind of contemporary art historian almost, sort of historicizing the contemporary moment. And I think she's great. I think she's a really authoritative figure. And then locally, Sean O'Toole, who used to be the editor of Art South Africa, now it's called Art Africa. He writes for freeze.com every now and then, and he tends to write South African or African-oriented reviews. So that's a really, really good kind of homespun take on local writing. Ashraf Jamal, who is the editor of Art Africa currently. Myself, Michael Smith, I've written a lot for ArtThrob. I used to be the managing editor of ArtThrob, so there's a fair amount of my writing that's out there in the ether. The editors of ArtThrob currently, Chad Rousseau and Tim Leibrandt, are also wonderful writers, but they're also great at finding, kind of curating good, cutting-edge writing. So www.artthrob.co.za is a great place to find good, solid writing that's maybe sometimes about artists that are closer to your level, which I think is a lot more accessible. So immerse yourself in art writing. If you don't get all of it, that's absolutely fine. Most of the time, I don't even understand what I've written. I'm kidding about that. I do. But I think, looking at what people are writing and understanding how they're pulling nuggets of meaning and truth out of the work that they're viewing is a great way for you to kind of think about how you can strategize your own production to make it more receptive. Remember, it's a very competitive market out there. There are a lot of artists graduating. There are undergrad artists that are coming out. There are MFA artists coming out, and they're all kind of competing for the same slice of the pizza. You need to kind of do that thing that makes you a little bit more competitive and gives more people the opportunity to look at your work, which is the kind of meaningful transaction of what the art world is about. So my first 7 points have spoken exclusively about things that you shouldn't do. It's kind of like a how not to guide. So from here, my part B, it's going to be a how-to guide. What are the things you should do? Well, my first point my first idea about what I think you should do is you should decide what your work is really about. And that can be very, very tricky. One of the great ways to do it, it's a bit of a corporate idea, and it's kind of something that's bandied around the internet a hell of a lot, but I think it's very, very powerful, is the idea of developing an elevator pitch. If the idea of an elevator pitch is if you worked at a company and you were an underling in a company, and you happened upon the CEO in the lobby, and you guys are going up to the same floor, you had an elevator ride's worth of time, so maybe about 30 seconds to a minute, maybe if it's a big building, 2 minutes, I don't know. And you had that amount of time to pitch the CEO your idea for making the company a lot of money, and that would result in your, change in your status within the company. The same can be done by artists. You can do a bit of an elevator pitch because, what are your conditions? You theoretically might be at an opening and you might be introduced via a friend to a great curator or, a great entrepreneur in the art space, or maybe even a buyer or a gallerist. And in a very conversational kind of non-pushy kind of way, you would get a chance to tell them what your art is about. So they'd say, oh, you're an artist. What do you do? Well, I make paintings. What are your paintings about? Cue your elevator pitch. Then your 30 seconds, your minute kicks in. And in order to do that, if you're sort of staring at the floor all coyly and kind of, moving your feet around and kind of going, well, it's hard to talk about what I do, they're going to lose interest. They're going to look immediately at the painting over your shoulder. They're going to grab another glass of wine, and you're going to lose your opportunity. It's probably not the only opportunity you'll get, but you can learn from that. You can do something with that opportunity if you do get it. So knowing what your art is about is super, super important. What are the salient facts, the essence of what you do? There may be a lot of and I think really good art very often involves awesome little side alleys, and little diversions, little kind of attention diversions and things that it's also about. But what is the main kind of spine of what you do? If you know that and you understand that and you can express that fairly simply and in a really good conversational way, you'll be one up on the competition, definitely. My second suggestion for what you should do when you're writing about your own artwork is, and it may seem incredibly obvious, write, rewrite, and rewrite. The critic I mentioned a few minutes ago, Jerry Saltz, he said there's no such thing as writing. There is only rewriting. If you're going to produce anything that people are going to kind of look at and consume in a meaningful way, you're going to have to rewrite. You're going to have to revisit your thoughts. You're going to have to refine what you've done in the same way that you would with your artwork. Only Picasso would kind of pick up his pen and generate an artwork worth millions in a couple of seconds on the back of a napkin or something like that. The very few of us have that right, or that authority. We have to produce work that's the result of a very long engaged process, and I feel like writing is an extension of that. You have to engage with what you're saying. You have to think about how you said it and how you can say it better. Interrogate the terms that you use, using terms like abstract, painterly, installation, new media. Again, are you understanding those? Are you using them correctly? Are you using a lot of passive voice, saying the artwork does this, instead of saying I do this in the artwork? Remember that active voice is a lot more powerful for people reading about your work or hearing about your work. Are you using very long sentences, long extended sentences with 5 or 6 key concepts in them? That's problematic. Rather cut it down into shorter sentences. And you can use quotations. You can, again, sort of bolster your position by using a theoretical base, but keep that to a minimum and make sure that it's the right theoretical base that you're kind of working from. Rewriting is not just about fixing errors. It's, as the slide suggests in your presentation, it's about refining your words, making them more effective. My third tip for what you should be doing when you're writing about your own artwork is explain your work to a friend out loud. When you've written your first draft or second draft or whatever it might be, if you feel like you're at the point where you need some sort of input, read it out to your studio mate, your family member, your significant other, or someone you trust with your thoughts and your feelings about your work. And while you're reading it, listen to what you're reading. Listen to where you think it catches, how it flows, the tone, if it stalls at all, where you repeat yourself unnecessarily. These are all super important things to consider when you're writing about your work. And very often we only hear those things when we read it out loud. So the spoken word can be quite different to the written word, and I know you're going to be producing the written word, but it is a really good way to sort of check what you're doing. Check that it flows conceptually, check that there's a thread running through it, and that you're not getting lost, because if you're getting lost, your reader's almost certainly going to get lost. My fourth and final point for what you should be doing when you're writing about your artwork is we live in a digital age. You're probably going to be sending it via email or text message or whatever it might be. I think maybe if you're WhatsApping your press release, you might have a larger problem than I can solve. But before you hit send on your email, go for a walk. And I'm not joking about that. Do yoga, go for a run, do stunts on your unicycle, whatever your specific physical activity is. Do something that takes you out of your mental zone and out of the zone of agonizing about your artwork and agonizing about the writing, and get you kind of re-embodied. And in that process, what very often happens is that you think about the thing that is most central in the piece that you've written. The central point, the central theme kind of comes back to you. And that's a really good way to judge whether or not that's the correct thing, the correct essence that you want to be communicating. I do a lot of drawings in my own practice, drawing charcoal and paper. And to me, this is the equivalent of kind of stepping back from my drawing and kind of squinting my eyes and staring at what I've done and checking whether the areas of texture and the areas of contrast are working. It's a way of kind of inserting critical distance that you literally don't get when the thing's here, physically or conceptually in your head. When you're kind of like completely immersed in it, you don't have that distance. You have to insert some sort of process for evaluating what you've written, whatever that might be. I strongly suggest it's not drinking booze or partying. That might be your process. Hemingway had a great quote where he said, write drunk but edit sober. So maybe you can build that into your process. But find a way to distance yourself from what you've written for a bit and to reevaluate it in that way. Thank you for watching this short video. I hope you have gained some better insights into how to write about your artwork. It's not rocket science. You can do it. I'm sure you've done it a million times before. Try to use my points if they work for you, any combination of them, and just keep writing. Keep writing about your work. Keep owning your own space, and create a dialogue with yourself about what the artwork is about by writing regularly, rewriting. You can even go back through this video, check out individual points. You can find me on social media if you want to sort of discuss any of them. Michael Graham Smith, I'm on Facebook. And yeah, hopefully we can also develop a dialogue between us about how to write about your work. Maybe you've got insights that I missed.